I wasn't snooping. That wasn't the intention. But the house was too quiet that morning. The coffee chilled in the cup while I arranged old papers on the kitchen table. It was then that I heard my grandson talking on the phone in the next room, with the cruel naturalness of someone who does not imagine he is being heard. He laughed softly before saying that it was only a matter of time for everything to be resolved. My name was not mentioned, but I knew immediately that they were talking about me. Something inside my chest contracted as if I had taken an invisible blow. He continued talking, mentioning the inheritance as if talking about a forgotten object in a drawer. He said that the family needed to get ahead to avoid problems later. The word then echoed in my head in a strange way, as if there was no longer one for me. I felt my legs get weak and I had to lean on the sink to keep from falling. At that moment, I understood that for them, I was already leaving, even though I was still breathing. I left the kitchen without making a sound, as if I were the intruder in my own house. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the corridor never seemed so long. I entered the room and closed the door slowly, trying to organize thoughts that ran over each other. I had spent my whole life taking care of that family, putting everyone before me, and now I discovered that my role had been reduced to a temporary obstacle. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my trembling hands, trying to understand at what point I became invisible. It wasn't just about money. I knew it in my heart of hearts. It was about the way they saw me, old, fragile, disposable. The sense of betrayal burned more than any physical pain I had ever felt. I felt humiliated, but most of all, deeply alone. The scariest thing was not the phrase itself, but the carefree tone with which it was said. There was no guilt, there was no hesitation, just certainty. That reminded me of other situations from the past. Small comments, decisions made without consulting me, things that I had ignored because I thought I was exaggerating. For the first time, I thought that maybe I had been naive for years. I spent the rest of the morning acting normally, as if nothing had happened. I prepared lunch, answered messages, smiled when necessary. Inside, however, something had broken irreversibly. Every gesture of affection seemed rehearsed. Every word sounded false. I watched everything in silence, trying to see beyond appearances. In the afternoon, the house became quiet again, and I allowed myself to cry for the first time. It wasn't a loud cry, it was contained, heavy, as if each tear carried decades of misplaced trust. I remembered how hard I worked to build what I had, how much I gave up my own dreams. To think that all this was being shared even before my end was devastating. That pain had no name, but it had weight. I tried to rationalize, to tell myself that maybe I had gotten it wrong. After all, who plans their own betrayal out loud in the victim's house? Still, my instinct screamed that there was something very wrong, a silent, insistent warning that I could no longer ignore. For the first time, I felt fear of the future in a concrete way. It wasn't fear of death, but of what they could do to me before it. In the early evening, as the sun hid behind the trees, the phone rang. The sound was so loud that it made me jump in my chair. I looked at the device as if it were an omen, and for a few seconds I thought about not answering. Something told me that this call was not common. I took a deep breath and answered, trying to keep my voice steady. On the other end of the line, a polite voice introduced himself as being from the bench. She mentioned my full name and asked if I had authorized recent change requests on my account. I felt the blood run cold in my veins before I even heard the rest of the sentence. My heart started beating too fast, and I had to sit down again. The call confirmed what I had feared since the morning. While the attendant explained the details, everything made sense in a cruel way. My grandson's conversation, the strange looks, the excessive care of the last few days. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't an old woman's confusion. Something was being done behind my back, something big. And in that moment, I knew my life was about to change forever. When I hung up the phone, silence took over the house again, but it was no longer the same. I was no longer the same. Fear was still there, pulsing strongly, but something new was beginning to emerge beneath it. A bitter lucidity, an urgent need to understand and react. They might have thought I was at the end of the line, but I was still here. And now, I was awake. The fact that you've chosen to be here, listening to this story so far, says a lot about who you are. What comes next isn't just about a family or an inheritance. It's about dignity, silence, and the moment when we decide not to be erased. If you believe that stories like this need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel and support this space where difficult truths do not stand alone. I spent that night almost without sleep, lying on my side, staring at the dark ceiling of the room. Every creak of the house felt like a sign that someone was awake, plotting something while I tried to pick up the pieces of my lucidity. The bank phone kept sticking in my head, repeating phrases like a cruel echo. Recent changes. Requests in progress. Lack of authorization. I wondered how many things had already been done without me knowing, and mainly, how long this had been happening. I got up before dawn, with my body heavy and my mind racing. I brewed coffee, but I could barely take a sip. I felt a knot in my stomach, a mixture of anxiety and incredulity. For years, I blindly trusted the people I called family. I delegated tasks, signed papers without reading them carefully, accepted help thinking it was careful. Now, each memory took on a suspicious tone, as if it were being revisited in too harsh a light. Shortly after 9 in the morning, the phone rang again. My heart raced immediately, as if my body already knew what was coming before my mind accepted it. I answered in a low voice, trying to appear calm. It was the same bank, the same attendant, now with a more serious tone. She asked me to confirm some data and then asked if I could attend the branch in person. He said that there were inconsistencies that needed to be clarified urgently. When I hung up, my hands were sweaty, and I had to sit at the table to catch my breath. Going to the bank meant facing reality head-on, leaving the illusory comfort of my home. It also meant the possibility of discovering something even worse. I thought about calling one of my children, asking for explanations, but something held me back. A new suspicious instinct told me that I needed to go alone, that any word out of turn could warn those who were trying to harm me. On the way to the branch, I observed the city as if I was seeing everything for the first time. People walking in a hurry, cars stopping at traffic lights, life going on normally while mine seemed suspended. I felt a twinge of envy at that simple normality. At the same time, a silent anger began to grow inside me. I hadn't done anything to deserve that. It was not fair to be treated as a nuisance at the end of the road. I was greeted by a manager who was too young, with a rehearsed smile and a watchful look. He invited me to sit down and began to explain the situation with excessive care, as if he were talking to someone who would not understand simple terms. That annoyed me more than it should have, but I stood my ground. He showed records of attempts to change beneficiaries, requests for detailed information about my investments, and even a power of attorney under analysis. A power of attorney that I never signed. I felt the ground disappear under my feet as I heard that word. Power of attorney. It was more serious than I had imagined. It wasn't just about curiosity or anticipation, but about control. Someone wanted to be able to decide for me, to act on my behalf, as if I was no longer capable. The manager asked, carefully, if I was experiencing any health problems that justified such requests. That question hurt more than anything else said so far. I took a deep breath before answering. She said she was lucid, healthy as much as possible for my age, and that she had not authorized any of that. As I spoke, I felt something change inside me. Fear was still there, but it was beginning to share space with indignation. I wasn't a confused old woman adrift. I knew exactly who I was and what was going on, and someone would have to answer for that. The manager explained that, to be safe, the bank had temporarily frozen any changes until he reached me. That brought me momentary relief, but it also confirmed that the threat was real. It was not imagination, nor exaggeration. There was a plan in the works, and I was the target. I left the agency with a folder of documents and my head boiling with thoughts. Each roll felt like proof that I needed to act fast. When I got home, I found the room empty, but I felt a different weight in the air. I sat on the couch and opened the folder carefully, reading every line, every date. Some names came up over and over again, names I knew all too well. My stomach churned as I noticed patterns, coordinated attempts, not isolated acts. It hadn't started that week. It had been prepared for months, perhaps years. I closed the briefcase and leaned my head against the back of the sofa, feeling a deep exhaustion. At the same time, a harsh clarity was setting in. I was alone in that fight, at least for now. The family I thought I had didn't exist the way I imagined, and if I wanted to protect my life, my money, and my dignity, I would have to stop pretending that nothing was happening. That night, I made the first conscious decision since it all began. I wouldn't confront anyone yet. I wouldn't cry in front of them, nor would I ask for explanations. I would observe, learn, and prepare. They thought I was weak, confused at the end of the line. Little did they know that that phone call had awakened something that I was unaware of. And once I woke up, I wouldn't go back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up with the strange feeling of being watched, even though I was alone in the room. There was no one there. But the idea that my life was being evaluated, weighed, and judged by others did not leave me at peace. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of age on my knees, and realized how that physical detail was used against me. To them, each slower step was a test of weakness. For me, it was always just the rhythm of someone who has lived too long. When I went down to the kitchen, I found my son sitting at the table, reading the newspaper as if nothing was out of place. He smiled when he saw me, a smile too fast, too rehearsed. He asked if I had slept well, with that tone of voice that is used with children or sick people. I answered yes, keeping my voice firm, although inside, everything was boiling. His condescension hurt me more than any direct accusation. As I prepared the coffee, I noticed how he watched me, attentive to my every gesture. If I took a long time to pick up a glass, his gaze changed. If I forgot a word, there was an uncomfortable silence soon after. It was as if he was mentally writing down my failures, creating an invisible report about my supposed disability. That reminded me of the bank manager's words, the question about my health. Everything was connected. Throughout the day, other family members passed by the house, always with some banal excuse. A quick visit, a sudden worry, I just came to see how you are. In every sentence, there was something false, something that didn't match the past. They spoke slowly, repeated simple explanations, corrected me when I disagreed. I felt diminished, as if my opinion had lost value without anyone having warned me. The most painful thing was to realize that I had allowed it myself, little by little. For years, I accepted that they decided for me to avoid conflicts. I let them take care of the accounts, the documents, the difficult choices. I believed it was love, protection. Now, I saw that there was also convenience and interest. By relinquishing control, I surrendered more than responsibilities. I handed over power. I remembered family gatherings where I was the last to speak, when I spoke, of decisions made for my good, without me being consulted. Everything seemed small at the time, almost irrelevant. But, added together, those situations formed a clear pattern. I had been pushed slowly out of life itself, without realizing it. The betrayal did not begin with the inheritance. It began with silence. In the middle of the afternoon, I heard my grandson laughing loudly in the backyard, talking on the phone again. I couldn't make out the words, but the carefree tone made me cringe. That same tone as the day before, full of certainty and haste. I thought about confronting him right there, demanding explanations. But I restrained myself. Something inside me already knew that it was not yet time. I needed to understand the game before I turned the tables. I sat in the living room with an open book on my lap, pretending to read, while observing everything around. Every movement, every exchange of glances, every sentence cut in half. I was learning to see for real, perhaps for the first time. And what I saw was not pretty. The family I believed I had was more like a council assessing when the right time would be to leave. The feeling of humiliation was constant, but strangely, it was accompanied by something new. A kind of coldness, of emotional distance that protected me from complete pain. It was as if I was moving away from the woman who accepted everything quietly. I still felt hurt, but I wasn't so lost anymore. Lucidity, though bitter, was a form of strength. That night, when I looked in the mirror before going to sleep, I saw more than wrinkles and gray hair. I saw someone tired, yes, but not defeated. They saw fragility. I was beginning to see resistance. He had spent his entire life surviving losses, sacrifices, and renunciations. This was just another battle, though it came from the most unexpected place. From my own home, I lay down with the uncomfortable certainty that their underestimation was a double-edged sword. The less they expected from me, the freer they felt to act. But it also meant that they didn't see me as a threat. Yet. I closed my eyes knowing that that image of a confused old woman could, at the right moment, work in my favor. For the first time since the phone call, I slept with an embryonic plan forming. When the light went out, a phrase echoed in my mind, firm and clear. They think I'm done. They think I don't understand. I don't see. I don't react. That would be the biggest advantage I would have. Because while they buried me alive, I began silently to prepare to fight. I began to notice the details that I had previously ignored due to fatigue or overconfidence. Small things, almost insignificant in isolation, but which together formed a disturbing design. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room, glances exchanged too quickly, cell phones being put away in a hurry. It was as if the house had developed its own language, of which I was no longer a part. And for the first time, this did not confuse me. He warned me. On a seemingly ordinary morning, I realized that some documents were no longer where they had always been. Old folders with house records and investments had been reorganized without me touching them. I casually asked if anyone had moved, and the answer came too quickly, too defensively. They said it was just to organize better, to make it easier when I needed it. The word one sounded like a warning, not a caution. I started to pay attention to the way they talked about me, even when they were being kind. They used phrases like, "She can't take this anymore," or "It's not worth worrying about these things." They didn't ask me what I wanted, stated what I supposedly needed. That hurt me, but it also showed me something important. They had already decided among themselves that I was no longer capable of deciding anything. One day I found my grandson flipping through a folder in the office, the same one I hadn't seen in weeks. He was startled when he saw me and tried to disguise it, saying that he was looking for an old receipt. I watched his trembling hands, the sweat on his forehead, the hurry to change the subject. He said nothing. I just smiled and left the room, letting him believe that I hadn't understood. Inside, I wrote down one more piece of that cruel puzzle. The visits began to intensify, always at strategic times. One son appeared when the other left, as if there was an invisible scale. They asked if I had taken my medicines, even when I didn't have any time nearby. They suggested medical appointments that I had not requested. The excessive worry was almost ridiculous, and I realized that it was not spontaneous. It was coordinated. One afternoon, I heard my name mentioned in a low conversation on the porch. I couldn't capture everything, but words like disability, time, and documents came to me like shrapnel. My heart raced, but I remained still, breathing slowly. That confirmed what I already feared. It was not just a question of future inheritance. There was a plan in progress, something concrete being prepared at that very moment. I started to feel like a stranger inside my own house. The objects were still mine, the memories too, but the atmosphere had changed. It was like living in occupied territory, where every step had to be calculated. At the same time, a part of me was awakening to this new reality with a cold clarity. I could no longer afford to trust blindly. I needed to learn how to survive inside. At night, alone in the room, I mentally went over every sign, every sentence out of place. Everything fell into place painfully. That was not improvisation, nor impulsive reaction. It was a project. And I was the obstacle to be removed with as little fuss as possible. The awareness of this brought me a deep fear, but also an unexpected determination. I didn't want to be taken by surprise anymore. I started to pretend to be distracted, to make small details wrong on purpose, to look more fragile than I really felt. If they wanted to believe I was confused, I would let them. Each underestimation of them became an extra layer of my protection. Behind that image, my mind worked fast, connecting facts, memories, and possibilities. I was learning to use what they thought of me against them. At times, emotional pain threatened to engulf me. There were days when I wanted to scream, demand respect, cry all at once, but I knew that this would only confirm the narrative they were creating about me. I swallowed my tears, took a deep breath, and continued watching. That restraint was not weakness. It was strategy, even if I didn't know exactly how to use it yet. I realized then that the biggest betrayal was not only in what they planned to do to me, but in the naturalness with which they did it, as if it were logical, necessary, even fair. That hardened me inside. The woman who accepted everything to keep the peace was falling behind. In her place, someone more cautious, more attentive, less willing to be manipulated emerged. That night, I mentally wrote down a list of everything I needed to protect. It wasn't just money or material goods. It was my autonomy, my history, my right to fully exist until the last day. They didn't know it yet, but every little sign of betrayal was preparing me for something bigger. And when the time came, I wouldn't be caught off guard again. Fear ceased to be a vague feeling that morning when I woke up and felt that something had been taken out of my grasp. I went to the drawer where I kept my medical documents and found too empty a space. Folders that had always been there had disappeared, as if they had never existed. My heart raced, and for a few seconds I stood still, trying to convince myself that I had moved them myself. But I knew I didn't. I searched the house with apparent calm, opening old cabinets and boxes, keeping my face neutral when someone passed by. Each empty drawer increased the pressure in my chest. Those papers were not just records. They were proof of my lucidity, of my autonomy. Without them, any narrative could be created. For the first time, I felt that the danger was not future. It was immediate. I casually asked if anyone had seen my briefcases. The answer came with reassuring smiles and vague phrases, such as, "They must be stored somewhere better." Better for whom, I thought. The naturalness with which they deviated from the subject made me freeze. There was no embarrassment, no surprise. That confirmed that I wasn't imagining things. They knew exactly what they were doing. That same day, I received a call from the doctor's office asking if I had authorized the sending of copies of my medical record. My whole body reacted before my mind. He said no, in a firm voice, despite the trembling in his hands. When I hung up, I had to lean on the table so I wouldn't fall. That was concrete proof that someone was preparing to declare me incapable. It was no longer just about money, it was about total control. The word incapable began to echo in my head like an early sentence. I thought about how easy it would be for them to paint me as confused, forgetful, vulnerable. A biased report, a few convenient testimonies would suffice. I have always feared physical dependence, but I never imagined having to fight the loss of my own voice. Fear now had a name, a face, and an intention. I sat alone in the living room, trying to breathe regularly. The walls, full of old photographs, seemed to watch me in silence. I felt small in the face of the possibility of being legally erased, as if my story could be reduced to a convenient diagnosis. That idea revolted me in a new, profound way. It wasn't just fear, it was indignation. I began to mentally review everything that could be used against me. Every banal forgetfulness, every stumble, every day of tiredness. Everything could become proof of decadence. At the same time, I thought about everything that proved the opposite. Bills paid on time, decisions made alone, a lifetime of lucidity. It was absurd that decades of competence could be annulled so easily, and yet the risk was real. That afternoon, I realized that I needed to tread more carefully than ever. Any emotional reaction could be used as an argument against me. I swallowed the urge to confront, to scream, to demand explanations. Instead, I began to mentally write down dates, names, behaviors. I was building my own defense even though I didn't know how or when I would use it. Fear also brought unexpected clarity. I understood that no one would come to save me if I didn't save myself first. The family, as I knew it, had already made their choice. I needed to stop expecting empathy and start thinking like someone who is being attacked. That change of posture was painful, but necessary. I could no longer just be the confused victim of history. At night, I locked the bedroom door like I hadn't done in years. The simple gesture gave me a strange sense of security and sadness at the same time. Lying in bed, I heard low voices in the house, suppressed laughter, careful footsteps. Everything seemed too normal for the one who was conspiring. That dissonance made me alert, awake, attentive to every sound. For the first time, I seriously considered the possibility of losing everything if I didn't act quickly. Home, money, freedom, respect. Fear is no longer abstract and has become an invisible timer counting against me. Still, under that pressure, something solidified inside me. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I wouldn't give up without a fight. When I finally closed my eyes, it was not to rest, but to think. Each heartbeat seemed to mark one more step in that dangerous game. They had struck the first real blow. Now, I needed to find a way to survive without revealing that I had already understood everything. The fear was great, but the desire to continue being the owner of my life was greater. The secret didn't appear all at once, as a dramatic revelation, but began to creep in uncomfortable fragments. An old memory, a poorly explained comment, a lingering sense that there was something wrong with my family's past. As I folded laundry on a quiet afternoon, I recalled a conversation many years ago, when I was still married, about a financial decision I had made in a hurry. At the time, I trusted. Now that memory came back with a different weight. I began to mentally revisit the years when everything seemed simpler. I remembered how certain assets were registered in names that were not exactly the most logical, of how I was convinced that it was better not to stress about legal details. I was tired, busy raising children, trying to keep the family together after difficult losses. It was the perfect terrain for decisions made by me, but not with me. One night, rummaging through old boxes in the back of the closet, I found a folder that I swore no longer existed. It was hidden behind old blankets, as if someone had tried to get rid of it without the courage to throw it away. Inside, there were copies of documents, old letters, and a contract that I didn't remember knowingly signing. As I read those yellowed pages, I felt my blood boiling. Something important had been decided without my being fully aware of the consequences. The cards were what hurt the most. Written by someone in the family, in an almost affectionate tone, they spoke of protection, of guaranteeing the future, of preventing me from being overloaded. But between the lines, there was control. There was a truth being carefully shaped so that I would believe that it was all for my good. I realized, with a tightness in my chest, that this manipulation was not recent. It came from afar. It was then that I understood why everyone seemed so safe now. Because they acted as if they had a right to what was mine. They had done it before, and they had succeeded. Inheritance, money, my autonomy have always been treated as something negotiable, as long as I was tired enough not to question it. The current betrayal was just the continuation of an unresolved story, buried under years of convenient silence. I felt a mixture of anger and shame for not having realized it sooner. Not because I was weak, but because I trusted too much. Trust, I learned too late, can be used as a weapon when it finds people willing to exploit it. That discovery changed everything. It wasn't just a reaction to a recent plan, It was the chance to finally face a truth that had been hidden from me for decades. I spent hours rereading each document, connecting dates, names, and decisions. Everything made sense now, in a cruelly logical way. The past explained the present, and the present threatened to repeat the past with even more violence. The idea of allowing this to happen again made me nauseous. I would not survive emotionally another betrayal of that magnitude. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the papers scattered in front of me. The house slept, oblivious to the silent earthquake that was happening inside me. For the first time, I didn't cry. There were tears in his eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, I felt something harden in my chest, a silent, firm decision, which needed no words. I realized that my biggest mistake in the past had been to believe that keeping the peace was worth any price, that giving in was always nobler than confronting. Now he saw that this choice had cost too much. The buried secret wasn't just about money or documents. It was about how my voice was systematically muffled in the name of a false harmony. The next morning, I put the briefcase in a safe place, away from prying eyes. No one noticed anything different about me, and I made sure to keep it that way. I smiled when expected. I answered kindly. I played my role as a fragile woman to perfection, but inside something had changed definitively. I knew too much to go back. The past had finally shown his face, and he was not handsome. Still, that truth gave me something precious. Clarity. I wasn't just fighting a recent plan, but an entire history of manipulation. And this time, I wouldn't allow them to bury my will again. The secret they tried to hide would be, at the right moment, the basis of my strength. The change in their behavior became more evident after that discovery. It was no longer just exaggerated concern or crossed comments. There was a new urgency in the air, as if they were running against an invisible deadline. The conversations became quieter, the meetings more frequent, and I began to feel that every day counted against me. It was as if my mere existence was getting in the way of a plan that needed to move forward. One morning, my oldest son suggested with a tense smile that it might be good for me to think about the future in a more practical way. He spoke of security, of avoiding bureaucracy later, of relieving the family of worries. He used soft words to wrap something much harder. As he spoke, I realized that he was not asking me anything. It only informed. That wasn't a conversation. It was a disguised warning. Shortly thereafter, an unexpected visitor put me on high alert. A social worker showed up at the door, saying she had received a request to assess my living conditions. The ground seemed to move under my feet. I kept calm, invited her in, and answered the questions clearly, but inside I trembled. Someone had taken the next step. They were testing the terrain, preparing the way. After the visit, I noticed glances exchanged in the kitchen, interrupted whispers as I approached. I didn't need to hear anything to understand everything. The threat now took concrete form. It was no longer a distant plan, but an ongoing action. The feeling of being surrounded by those who were supposed to protect me was suffocating. I slept little, always alert, as if any carelessness could be used against me. The cruelest thing was the naturalness with which they did all this. No one raised their voices, no one showed anger. On the contrary, they were too kind, too helpful. This false delicacy gave me chills. I would prefer screams and open accusations to that calculated care, which hid such clear intentions. They no longer saw me as a mother or grandmother, but as a problem to be solved. At times I even doubted myself. I wondered if I wasn't exaggerating, if fear wasn't distorting everything. But then he remembered the missing documents, the bank call, the hidden briefcase, the unexpected visit. They were not coincidences. It was a siege, and I was in the center of it, alone, trying to maintain lucidity while pushing me out of life itself. I started to measure every word, every gesture. If she showed indignation, she could be seen as unstable. If she cried, how weak. I learned to smile at the right moment, to agree when necessary, to look oblivious. That constant performance exhausted me, but it also kept me safe. They believed that the plan was going ahead without obstacles. They had no idea how much I observed. The house, which had always been my refuge, began to feel like hostile territory. I closed the door of my room at night with the feeling of defending myself from invisible enemies. Hearing footsteps in the hallway made me tense. Every low conversation sounded like a conspiracy. It was exhausting to live like this, but I couldn't afford to relax. One mistake could cost everything. Despite the fear, something inside me refused to budge. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was survival instinct. I had already faced too many losses to accept being erased like that. The idea of being declared incapable, of losing my voice officially, revolted me deeply. That was not only unfair, it was a silent violence. It was in this climate of constant threat that I realized something important. They were united, but they were not as solid as they seemed. There were tensions, small disagreements, looks of distrust between them. Not everyone fully agreed with what was being done. That realization turned on a dim but persistent light. Perhaps there was a breach in that seemingly insurmountable wall. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought the family had already crossed a line of no return. It was no longer about heartaches or disappointments. It was a struggle for my existence as a whole, capable and conscious person. And if they had decided to treat me as a threat to their comfort, I would have had to accept a painful truth. Sometimes, surviving means facing the very people who should love us the most. I didn't expect help. In fact, I had already accepted that this battle would be fought in silence, alone, within the limits of my own resistance. That's why that afternoon's phone call caught me completely off guard. I recognized the name on the display with an odd delay, as if it came from a past life. It was someone I hadn't seen in years, but I knew too much to ignore. I answered cautiously, not imagining how much that call would change everything. The voice on the other end seemed hesitant, as if it was measuring every word before saying it. He said he needed to talk to me personally, that there were things I should know. The serious tone contrasted with the familiarity of the past, and that put me on immediate alert. I asked him what it was about, but he deflected, saying only that it had to do with my family. My heart raced, and a chill ran down my spine. We arranged to meet in a discreet cafe far from my home. I made up some excuse to leave, aware that my every move was watched. During the journey, I thought about giving up, about going back. Trusting someone at that moment seemed like a huge risk. Still, something inside me said I needed to hear what he had to say. Maybe it was intuition, maybe desperation. When I saw him sitting at the table, I noticed on his face an expression that mixed guilt and determination. After a few trivial words, he got straight to the point. I said that I had participated years ago in family conversations about financial decisions that involved me, decisions that, according to him, were never fully explained to me. As I listened to it, I felt the air become heavy, as if each sentence tore away a layer of illusion that I still carried. He said that he had recently been contacted again by members of my family. They wanted information, documents, opinions that could reinforce the idea that I was no longer in a position to take care of myself. He said that it bothered him deeply, because he knew it was not true. More than that, he knew that there was an unresolved story, an old mistake that was being repeated, and he no longer wanted to be an accomplice. As he spoke, I felt a mixture of relief and pain. Relief that I wasn't crazy, that I finally heard from an outsider that my suspicions were well-founded. Pain for realizing how far it went, involving people and decisions from decades ago. He mentioned documents, informal agreements, silent pressures that I never knew existed. Everything fit together in a cruelly clear way. I asked him why he had decided to speak now. He lowered his eyes for a moment before answering that the weight of it never left him. He said that he saw me being treated as incapable, when he always knew my strength, who regretted having been silent in the past. Those words touched something deep in me. For the first time in a long time, I felt that someone was really seeing me. He offered to help, not with grandiose promises, but with facts, memories, contacts. He said he could testify if necessary, that I had kept copies of some documents that could prove that important decisions were made without my full consent. That offer seemed almost unreal. An ally, appearing in the middle of the siege, when I was already preparing to resist alone. I left that meeting with my mind boiling. I walked slowly, trying to absorb everything I had heard. It was not just a practical aid, it was a profound validation of my lucidity. I wasn't exaggerating nor inventing threats. Someone from the outside saw the same as me. That gave me a strength that I hadn't felt in a long time. When I got home, I realized that something had changed inside me. The fear still existed, but it was no longer paralyzing. Now it was accompanied by possibilities. I had information, I had support, I had a real breach in that wall that seemed insurmountable. For the first time, I began to believe that I could turn the tide. Not for revenge, but for justice. I carefully guarded everything he had given me, mentally and concretely. He knew that any misstep could put everything to waste. Still, I walked to the bedroom with a slightly more upright posture. They continued to see me as fragile, confused, vulnerable. Little did they know that, outside those walls, someone had reached out, and I had decided to hold her. That night, as I went to bed, I felt something rare. Hope. Not a naive hope that everything would be resolved easily, but the certainty that I was no longer alone in the darkness. The game had changed. I was still the underrated woman inside that house, but now I carried a powerful secret. An unexpected ally had emerged, and with it, the real possibility of transforming fear into strategy. After that meeting, I went back to living indoors as if nothing had changed. At least that's what they saw. I continued to sit at the table at the same times, asking the same banal questions, feigning confusion when it suited me. Inside, however, I was no longer the same. The humiliation still existed, but now it had turned into fuel. Every look of pity, every condescending tone, reinforced my resolve not to react impulsively. I began to observe more closely than ever, not just what they said, but how they said it. Who spoke to whom, at what times, and who seemed most nervous when certain subjects came up. There was a silent choreography between them, rehearsed and repeated. And like all choreography, it had flaws. Small mismatches, subtle contradictions, silences that said more than words. I absorbed everything in silence. The humiliation manifested itself in the simplest gestures. When they spoke for me on the phone, when they decided on appointments without consulting me, when they praised my docility. Each of these situations hurt me, but it also taught me. I began to understand exactly how they saw me and how they intended to use me. That image of a fragile woman was the basis of their plan, and I've decided to keep it intact for now. There were days when the urge to confront was almost unbearable, in which I wanted to put all the documents on the table, demand explanations, ask how they had courage. But I remembered the past, how direct confrontations always ended up with me giving in to keep the peace. Not this time. Silence was now not submission. It was a conscious choice. It was a strategic pause before the right move. I started to organize my own routine away from their eyes. Small outings, quick calls, notes taken and kept away from home. I memorized important information in case papers disappeared again. I trained my own calm, taking a deep breath before responding to any provocation. The more they underestimated me, the freer they felt to act. And the freer they felt, the more mistakes they made. I noticed that some of them were starting to get impatient. The delay in moving forward with the plan created internal friction. One wanted to accelerate, another preferred caution. These fissures were subtle, but real. I watched them as if watching a wall slowly crack. I didn't need to push. It was enough to wait for the right moment for everything to collapse with its own weight. At night, alone in the room, I mentally went over every detail of the day. There was no more room for naivety. Every word had an intention. Every gesture had a function. This constant vigilance was tiring, but it also kept me awake. The woman who had previously avoided conflict now studied scenarios. I was learning to play a game that I never wanted to play, but that was now inevitable. The greatest humiliation came on an afternoon when they suggested, in front of me, that perhaps it was better to simplify my life. They spoke of ready decisions, of rest, of letting others take care of everything. I smiled and nodded, feeling my stomach churn. Inside, I made a silent promise. That would be the last time he would pretend to agree without having something prepared in return. I began to see my own transformation with a certain strangeness. It was not an explosive change, but a firm one, almost imperceptible. I spoke less, listened more. I reacted less, thought more. The pain was still there, but it no longer dominated me. I was learning to separate feeling from action, something I had never done before. That made me stronger than I imagined I was capable of. At times, I wondered if I was becoming too cold, if that quiet strategy wasn't taking me away from who I used to be. But he soon understood that it was not coldness, it was self-preservation. I wasn't ceasing to feel it. I was choosing when and how to act. And that made all the difference. For the first time, I controlled the pace of the situation. When I went to bed exhausted, there was a new, different tiredness. It wasn't just physical. It wasn't just emotional. It was the weight of always being alert. Still, there was something comforting about this state. I knew I was no longer adrift. Each day of strategic silence brought me closer to a turning point. They believed I was fading away. In fact, I was preparing. The turning point did not happen dramatically, but silently, almost invisible to those who were not paying attention. It started the moment I accepted without guilt that I needed to learn to play by their rules, and then change them. With the help of my ally, I came to understand legal terms that I had previously avoided, documents that always seemed too complicated to me. Each explanation was how to regain a piece of my lost autonomy. We spoke little and carefully, always outside the house. He explained to me how interdiction processes worked, what signs were used to justify disability, and what I needed to avoid at all costs. That scared me, but it also strengthened me. Knowledge has always been power, and I was taking back a power that had been taken away from me little by little. For the first time, I knew exactly what was at stake. I started to review my own past decisions with another eye, where I had given too much, where I had trusted without question, not to blame me, but to understand. That cold analysis of my own history gave me something precious: clarity. I wasn't weak. She had been educated to avoid conflict, to keep her family together at any cost. Now that price was too high. I started organizing tests of who I was today. Records of payments, commitments fulfilled, recent decisions made by me alone. I wrote down dates, times, conversations, anything that could demonstrate my lucidity and capacity. Every little detail was a piece of defense. I didn't know when I would need it, but I knew I would need to be ready. At home, I continued to play my role perfectly. I purposely forgot a name here, asked for help there, let them explain obvious things to me. They seemed satisfied, confident that the plan was moving forward without resistance. This false tranquility of theirs gave me an advantage. The safer they felt, the less careful they became, and I wrote everything down, mentally. There was a specific moment when I realized that I had crossed an inside line. One day when I heard a conversation clearly planning the next steps, and instead of feeling panicked, I felt calculation. I evaluated risks, thought about consequences, projected scenarios. That cold reaction surprised me. The frightened woman of the beginning no longer existed in the same way. In his place, there was someone who thought strategically. My ally warned me that their next move could be decisive, a formal attempt, something that would involve authorities or lawyers. Knowing this gave me a strange sense of control. The unknown was more frightening than the named danger. Now I knew what to expect, and knowing it, I could prepare myself. I started to take even more care of my posture, my speech, my image, not for vanity, but for survival. Every meeting, every conversation was an opportunity to show consistency. I deliberately became predictable and stable. They wanted to paint me as unstable. I would become the opposite of that, irrefutably. At night, when I was alone, I allowed myself to feel the anger, the sadness, the disappointment. I no longer repressed them, but I also did not let them guide my actions. I learned to separate emotion from strategy. That was one of the hardest and most valuable lessons of my entire life. Feeling did not mean acting impulsively. It meant recognizing and choosing. I realized that I was no longer afraid of losing their love. This love, as it now presented itself, was too conditional. I was willing to lose illusions to gain respect. This acceptance was liberating. He no longer needed to please or convince. I just needed to protect my existence as a whole person. When I looked in the mirror that week, I saw something different in my own eyes. It was not hardness, but firmness. The woman who had always avoided games now understood the rules and knew how to use them. I hadn't won yet, far from it, but it was no longer just the piece being moved. I had learned how to play, and soon I would make my most important move. I realized that something was about to happen on the day the house dawned too organized. There was no chaos. Everything seemed clean, silent, controlled. This kind of order never came by chance. It was the kind of calm that precedes a decision made without you. My body felt it before my mind accepted it. That would be a decisive day. During breakfast, they talked to me as if they were walking on eggshells. Kind, careful, attentive to every word I said. That artificial delicacy put me on high alert. When my son suggested we have an important conversation later, I knew. I didn't ask about what. I just nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Inside, everything lined up like pieces finally fitted. Hours later, they sat with me in the living room as if it were an ordinary family gathering. They said they were concerned about my well-being, that they had noticed my tiredness, my occasional confusion. They used small, almost ridiculous examples, as if they were incontrovertible proofs. As they spoke, I watched them with cold attention. Every argument was rehearsed, every pause calculated. That was not taken care of. It was a disguised accusation. Then came the phrase that confirmed everything. They said they had scheduled a formal evaluation, something preventive, just to make sure everything was in order. They didn't ask if I agreed. They informed. The tone was that of someone who believes he is doing a favor. I felt my stomach sink, but I kept my posture. I calmly asked when it would be. The surprise on their faces was barely noticeable, but it was there. They expected resistance, not control. When I was alone after that conversation, my hands trembled. Not of fear, but of adrenaline. The final attempt had begun. That was what my ally had predicted. A formal, quick action, before I could react. For a few minutes, I felt the crushing weight of the situation. Everything I had built could be taken with a signature, a report, a decision of others. That vulnerability was real. I took a deep breath and sat down at the table with the documents I had been gathering. For the first time, I felt no doubt. Every paper, every note, every date had a clear purpose now. It was no longer abstract preparation. It was immediate defense. I called my ally in a firm voice and said only that the moment had come. He asked no questions. He said he would be with me every step of the way. In the following days, I lived a double routine. For them, I remained cooperative, even grateful for their concern. For me, every gesture was calculated. I prepared for evaluations, organized receipts, revised my own history with almost surgical precision. I wasn't trying to look perfect. I was being exactly who I had always been: lucid, responsible, conscious. The difference was that now I knew I needed to prove it. There was a moment, alone in the room, when fear almost overcame. I thought about how easy it would be to give in, to accept that they decided for me, to rest from that constant tension. The temptation to give up came strongly, accompanied by a deep tiredness. But then I remembered everything I had already lost by giving in before, of the silent voice, of the decisions made without me. That gave me back my strength. On the day of the evaluation, I walked to the door with my spine erect. Not because I wasn't nervous, but because I refused to look smaller than I was. I answered the questions clearly, without haste, without anger. Each answer was a silent reminder that I was there, whole. I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the discomfort of those who expected something different. That gave me bitter satisfaction. When the process moved to the legal sphere, I realized that the game had really changed. It was no longer just a family trying to control an elderly woman. It was a formal dispute, with real consequences. And this time, I wasn't unprepared. I had proof, support, and above all, awareness of what was happening. The final attempt against me had been made. Now the answer was in motion. That night, when I went to bed, I felt a deep tiredness, but different from anything I had felt before. It was not exhaustion of those who flee, but of those who face. I knew that the confrontation was not over yet, but he also knew that he had survived the most dangerous moment so far. They had shown all the cards, and I was still on my feet, ready for whatever came next. This is the hardest part to share. Talking about this means exposing losses that still weigh, choices that cost me relationships, and a silence that I carried for too long. If you've stayed this far, it's because you understand that some truths only survive when someone has the courage to say them out loud. So I ask you, sign up, not as a support for me, but as an act of preserving the voice, so that stories like this don't disappear when they most need to be heard. The day of the confrontation dawned gray, as if the sky knew that something definitive was about to happen. I dressed carefully, choosing simple but firm clothes that reflected exactly who I was. I didn't want to look fragile nor aggressive. I wanted to look real. As I looked in the mirror, I felt a knot in my stomach, but also a strange serenity. I had done everything in my power to get there prepared. As I entered the room where everything would be decided, I felt the weight of the looks on me, some loaded with impatience, others with false worry. My family members were sitting on one side, united by a confidence that seemed rehearsed. On the other, me, accompanied by those who chose to stay by my side when I needed them most. That physical division said a lot about what was really at stake. It wasn't just a legal issue. It was a symbolic break. When they started talking, I heard accusations disguised as caution, comments about my age, my health, my supposed difficulty in dealing with complex issues. Every word was calculated to seem reasonable, almost inevitable. Meanwhile, I took a deep breath, keeping my gaze steady. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react impulsively. I let them tell them everything they had prepared. This was the first time I had really listened to them without trying to please. When it was my turn, I felt a heavy silence settle in. I started speaking slowly, clearly, telling my own story, not as a victim, but as a protagonist. I talked about my decisions, my daily life, my life built over decades. I presented documents, records, proofs of lucidity and autonomy. Each paper placed on the table was a piece of the narrative that they tried to take away from me. I was regaining control of my voice. There was a moment when I mentioned the past, the old decisions made without my full consent. I saw expressions change, eyes averted. The buried secret finally breathed out of the shadow. I didn't have to accuse directly. The facts spoke for themselves. That changed the mood of the room. What once seemed like an administrative process began to reveal much deeper layers of manipulation. My ally spoke next, confirming what I had said. He testified about old conversations, about silent pressures, about how my trust was used as a tool of control. Hearing those words from someone else was painful and liberating at the same time. It was no longer just the version of me. It was the truth taking shape, supported by more than one voice. For the first time, I felt that I didn't have to fend for myself alone. On the other hand, there were attempts to minimize, justify, relativize. They said that everything was done out of love, out of concern, out of fear of seeing me suffer. That almost made me laugh, if it weren't so sad. Love is not imposed. It is not organized in secret. It is not silent. I kept calm as I dismantled, point by point, that comfortable narrative. My every answer was firm, without raising the tone. I didn't need to scream to be heard. The atmosphere became tense when more objective legal issues came to light. Dates that didn't match, suspicious signatures, requests made without clear authorization. I saw their security begin to crumble. That control they seemed to have slipped slowly through their fingers. I didn't feel pleasure in it, just a cold observation. The truth, when exposed, does not need spectacle to make an impact. At the end, silence returned to dominate the room. There was not much more to say. Everything was there, too clear to ignore. I felt a deep tiredness, as if years of tension were finally weighing on my shoulders at once. Still, I maintained my posture until the last moment. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about regaining my dignity in front of everyone. When the decision was announced, I felt the air return to my lungs. It was not a complete victory, nor a glorious ending. It was the recognition of my autonomy, of my ability to decide for myself. That was enough. I looked at those who tried to silence me, and I saw no more anger, only distance. Something irreversible had happened there. The masks had fallen. As I left that room, I walked slowly, feeling the weight and relief mix. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. And strangely, that didn't scare me. The confrontation had happened. The truth had been told. Now, I needed to deal with the consequences and rebuild my life from that point, with fewer illusions and more truth. The silence that followed the decision was more deafening than any screaming. My family members avoided my gaze as they collected papers, bags, and poorly formulated justifications. For the first time, there was no script, no ready-made phrases to frame me as fragile or confused. The masks had fallen, and what was left was pure discomfort. I observed everything with a calmness that I did not recognize in myself. Some tried to approach later, still inside the building, as if an apology could be improvised right there. The words came out truncated, full of misunderstandings and good intentions. I listened in silence, without interrupting, without reacting. Not because he accepted, but because he no longer needed to argue. The truth had been exposed in public. Any attempt to rewrite history sounded too empty. There were those who chose the opposite path. The cold withdrawal, the hard look, the sorrow transformed into silent accusation, as if I had committed a greater betrayal by defending myself than they had by trying to control me. That hurt more than I expected. Not for the loss itself, but for the confirmation that some ties only existed as long as I was convenient. When I stopped being, I stopped serving. As I left the building, I felt the cold air on my face like a reality check. The city went about its normal pace, indifferent to the emotional earthquake that had just happened in my life. People were rushing past. Cars were honking. The world had not stopped for my confrontation. That brought me a strange sense of humility and strength at the same time. My struggle was immense to me, but invisible to the rest of the world. On the way back, the weight of the losses began to set in, not only of the family I thought I had, but of the image I built over the years. The conciliatory mother, the grandmother always available, the woman who avoided conflicts at any cost. That version of me had broken definitively. And while it hurt, there was also a deep relief in no longer having to support her. At home, I walked through the rooms with a new look. Everything looked the same, but nothing was. The objects, the photos, the furniture now carried a different, more honest silence. I sat in the living room and let fatigue finally catch up with me. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there, breathing, allowing the emptiness to manifest without trying to fill it with justifications. Later, alone in the room, the tears came. They were not of despair, but of mourning. I fight for relationships that were never what I thought, for years of concessions made in the name of a peace that only existed for others. I also cried for the woman I was and who didn't know how to defend herself. Each tear seemed to close an old chapter of my life. I thought about how different everything would have been if the truth had come out sooner. But I soon understood that this kind of thinking led nowhere. The past cannot be fixed, is understandable, and I finally understood. The fall of the masks was not only theirs, it was mine too. I stopped pretending everything was fine when it never was. In the following days, the consequences began to materialize. Prolonged silences, unanswered messages, invitations that did not come. The family was reorganizing without me in the center, and that hurt. But it also gave me room for something new. For the first time, I didn't have to occupy a role that diminished me. Emptiness was slowly beginning to turn into possibility. There were moments of doubt, when I wondered if the price had not been too high, if it was worth losing so much to maintain my autonomy. At those times, I remembered the fear of being legally erased, the feeling of not having a voice. And then the answer was clear, almost automatic. Yes, it was. No relationship justifies the annulment of who you are. I realized that the real fall of the masks was not only in what others showed, but in what I myself failed to hide. My strength was not new. It was always there, muffled by other people's expectations. Now she was exposed, even if it cost me comfort. The woman who emerged from that confrontation was no longer naive, nor too conciliatory. It was someone whole. As I lay down that night, I felt a deep exhaustion, mixed with a strange sense of lightness. I had lost important things, but I had also gotten rid of invisible weights. The fall had been hard, but necessary. The masks were on the floor, and for the first time in a long time, I could breathe without pretending. The victory did not come with applause or a sense of immediate relief. It came silent, heavy, almost uncomfortable. In the days following the match, I realized that winning didn't mean going back to normal. It meant accepting that normal, as I knew it, no longer existed. The house was emptier, not only of people, but of expectations that I carried for years without realizing it. Some family members disappeared completely, as if the removal was a punishment for what I did. Others maintained a minimal, cold, bureaucratic contact. Short messages, dry replies, no real attempt at reconstruction. It hurt, even when I tried to pretend it didn't. Rejection, when it comes from those who should love us, leaves marks that are hard to ignore. Still, I didn't regret it. I started to deal with veiled comments, indirect ones spread by third parties, poorly told stories that painted me as harsh, ungrateful, exaggerated. I discovered that defending one's dignity has a high social cost, especially when it breaks comfortable narratives. At times, I felt like explaining myself, justifying my choices. But I soon understood that those who didn't want to hear the truth before weren't interested in it now. At the same time, something inside me was different. I walked more steadily, even when my heart was heavy. I made decisions without asking permission, organized my routine in my own way, chose my own silences. The autonomy I had regained was not only cool, it was emotional. For the first time, I didn't shape my actions to avoid displeasing anyone. This was liberating and frightening at the same time. There were difficult nights when the silence of the house seemed too great. At these times, loneliness came strong, bringing old doubts. I wondered if it would have been possible to act differently, if there was a less painful path. But it was enough to remember the fear I felt, the concrete threat of losing my voice, for these doubts to dissipate. Peace bought with submission was never real peace. I began to reorganize my life in small gestures. I changed simple things at home, undid habits that no longer made sense, resumed activities that I had abandoned due to lack of time or energy. Each change was a silent reminder that I still had choices. It was not a grandiose reconstruction, but a constant one, and that gave me a sense of continuity, even in the midst of losses. Some outsiders came closer, neighbors, old acquaintances, people who had always been there, but who I had never really seen. In these new conversations, there were no demands, no unrealistic expectations, just respect. That showed me that family is not always the one who shares the same surname, but the one who recognizes its humanity without trying to control it. The victory also brought a different kind of fatigue. Not the fatigue of fighting, but that of adaptation. I was learning to live without certain bonds, without certain emotional obligations. It was a slow process, sometimes painful, but necessary. Each day without pretense was a day gained, even when it was accompanied by longing or sadness. At times, I missed the woman I was before, lighter, less suspicious. But I knew that version of me only existed because I didn't see everything. Lucidity takes its toll, and I was willing to pay it. He preferred the hard truth to the comfortable illusion. This choice, though lonely on certain days, kept me whole. I looked back and saw clearly how much I had changed. She was no longer the woman who accepted everything to maintain harmony. Nor did I become bitter or closed. I had learned to set limits. Victory did not turn me into someone invincible, but into someone aware of my own strength, and no one else could take that away from me. At the end of that phase, I understood that winning does not mean coming out unscathed. It means going out true to yourself. The price was high, yes, but less than the cost of continuing to live a life that no longer belonged to me. I had lost relationships, but I had found myself. And in that imperfect balance between pain and dignity, I began to build something new. The reconstruction did not happen all at once, nor did it follow a clear plan. It came in small, almost imperceptible waves, as if relearning to breathe after a long time holding the air. Gradually, I occupied the spaces left by the silence with my own choices. Not to prove anything to anyone, but to remind myself daily that I was still the owner of my life. This simple and powerful awareness began to sustain me. There was no complete reconciliation with the family, and I learned to accept that without trying to fix the unfixable. Some contacts remained, formal and distant, like fragile bridges that no one dared to cross entirely. Others were lost for good, without dramatic goodbyes. It hurt, yes, but it didn't destroy me. I no longer needed their approval to exist in peace. I started to look at myself with a respect that I had never exercised before. Not as a victim who survived, but as a woman who chose not to erase herself. I recognized my failures, my past concessions, without using them as a whip. They were part of the story, but they no longer defined the ending. I wasn't naive or guilty. I was someone who learned, albeit late, to defend himself. There was a specific, simple day when I realized how much I had changed. I was sitting alone, solving practical matters, making decisions without consulting anyone, without fear. No anxiety, no guilt, just clarity. At that moment, I understood that strength does not always manifest itself in grand gestures. Sometimes it appears in the quiet silence of someone who knows exactly who it is. The past still existed, of course. The memories did not disappear, nor did the emotional scars. But they no longer bled. They had become marks of resistance, not open pain. I didn't try to erase what I experienced, integrated. Every experience, even the hardest ones, had brought me there. And there, finally, I felt whole. I started to allow myself new bonds, carefully, without haste. People who didn't want to drive me, just walk alongside. I discovered that trust doesn't have to be blind to be true. It can be built with clear boundaries, mutual respect, and real listening. This discovery completely changed the way I related to the world. I did not become bitter, as some might have hoped. I also didn't become tough on the outside. The hardness stayed inside, as a structure, a kind of invisible steel that sustained my delicacy, without leaving it vulnerable. I was still sensitive, empathetic, but now I knew how to say no. He knew how to get out. He knew how to stay. That was the real transformation. At times, I missed the woman I was before all this. More trusting in people, less vigilant. But soon he understood that this woman only existed because he did not know the whole truth. I didn't want to go back. I would rather move forward with the consciousness I have conquered. Lucidity, even when it weighs heavily, is a profound form of freedom. Today, when I think about everything that happened, I feel no desire for revenge or need for recognition. What I feel is something more serene and definitive. I survived the attempt to erase myself. I regained my voice when they tried to take it away. Nobody can reverse this. It doesn't matter what they say or think. History has already been written. There was no fairy tale ending, no promise of eternal union. There was something rarer and more valuable. There was dignity. There was a choice. There was the possible, imperfect, real reconstruction. I didn't go back to who I was before. I became my own again. And that, after all, is the greatest victory anyone can have. If something that has been told here touched you, share this video. Not as an automatic gesture, but as the real chance that this story will reach someone who is currently being silenced, underestimated, or treated as disposable. Sharing is transforming an individual experience into a collective alert, a simple and concrete way to break patterns that only survive in silence. I'll stay here, reading each comment carefully. Tell me, what city or country are you watching from? And what about this story stayed with you after the video ended? Reading your words really matters to me. It doesn't go unnoticed.